or share a story on the air, please call toll-free 888-565-1470. Once again, that's 888-565-1470. Now, let's talk legal with Jeff Van Treese.
Good evening and welcome to another edition of Talk Legal. I'm your host, Jeff Van Treese. I'm an attorney with the law firm Oltman, Flynn & Kubler, where we practice intellectual property law, including patents, trademarks, and copyrights. You can check us out online and view all archived episodes of this show on our website at oltmanpatent.com. That's OLTMANPATENT.com. I'd like to thank all of our listeners, including those of you tuning in on the AM dial, as well as those watching online. If you have a question, comment, or story that you'd like to share on the air, please feel free to call us toll-free at 888-565-1470. We welcome your calls. For those of you watching online, I'd like to apologize. Unfortunately, Ustream is down throughout the country this afternoon. And you can still listen to us online on the NN website or on oltmanpatent.com, but the actual video stream will not be up. It's not up right now. Hopefully it will be up sometime this evening or early tomorrow. So let's get right to it. My guest this evening is Spencer Kuven. Spencer is an attorney with the law offices of Craig T. Goldenfarb in West Palm Beach. He practices in a variety of areas, including personal injury, medical malpractice, and tonight we're going to be discussing one of his cases that's in the news, and that is he represents the only alleged victim of Bill Cosby that is still within the statute of limitations to bring a cause of action against him. So, Spencer, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me here, Jeff.
So tell us a little bit about this case. The Cosby case broke a few months ago. As has been publicized, most of the victims are outside the statute of limitations, both on the criminal charges as well as any civil charge being brought. With your client, there is a potential both on the criminal side and the civil side. So if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Thank you. When my client originally contacted me, obviously one of the first things we look at as a firm is whether or not there's a potential action that could be brought. And I've represented victims of sexual abuse in the past and other cases. And in those types of cases, the first thing we look for is whether or not there can be any criminal charges brought, because obviously that's our first and foremost focus, is bringing the person to justice that's perpetrated these types of acts. So the first thing obviously we did was evaluate whether or not we thought, based upon where the incident had occurred, which in our situation was California, whether or not there could be criminal charges brought. After looking at certain California laws and discussing it with local California lawyers, we decided to take my client out to the LA Police Department, which I did, and gave a full statement to the LA Police Department, and then let them evaluate the case and what she had told them about the incident itself, and then make a decision whether or not they wanted to utilize that information to prosecute Mr. Cosby, call him in for further questioning, get further information, or whatever they wanted to do at that point. So we're in that process right now, and we're still waiting to hear from the LA Police Department.
So the way that it works is that if somebody's charged criminally, if they are convicted, then that is conclusive on the civil side. In other words, you wouldn't have to prove anything from the plaintiff's perspective on the civil side if the defendant is convicted in criminal court. If the defendant is not charged, or even if they're acquitted, as happened in the OJ Simpson case 20 years ago, you can still bring a civil action, and that has to do with the standard of proof. Right. That is, in criminal court, the defendant must be proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. In a civil trial, the plaintiff has to prove their case beyond the preponderance of the evidence, which is essentially more likely than not that the defendant committed the crime or tort in this case. You have to prove it 51% likelihood, essentially. So going forward, you're waiting for the criminal charges to be brought. If they're not brought, what's going to happen from there?
Ultimately, and you're correct in what you're saying. In Florida, by the way, the jury instruction that we give to jurors here is actually the greater weight of the evidence. So the analogy I give to jurors is imagining Lady Justice and the scales of justice, and the greater weight of the evidence would be like placing something on that scale. It doesn't need to be a great thing, could be a piece of paper, but just to where the scales have tilted in one direction more likely than not. In other words, that greater weight comes into play. So if in fact the criminal action does not proceed, then if my client wants to proceed in a civil action, we would have to do so before the statute of limitations had run, so that she still has an action pending. So theoretically, I would like to wait for the criminal prosecution to play out, but realistically, if it doesn't play out in time, we would have to file suit to preserve any claims she may have.
Now, how is the statute of limitations calculated for purposes of a sexual assault claim?
In California, which is different, every state has different statute of limitations on different things. But in California, for a sexual assault like this, it is 8 years after age of majority. So in other words, up until the age of 26 years old. This particular crime occurred, we believe, back in when she was 18. So she would have until age 26, which would run roughly next year in 2016.
So what can you tell us about the actual accusations?
My client has given a statement. Actually, before she retained us, she was interviewed online, and there were statements online. And basically, to reiterate, her story is she went to the Playboy Mansion. She was invited by a friend to go out to the mansion one evening for a party. While she was out at that party with her friend, they're invited in, and once she enters into the home, she's approached by Cosby as well as Hugh Hefner, who both approach her and ask if they would like a drink. Both girls say sure, and at that point, Mr. Cosby leaves the group, goes somewhere and gets drinks, comes back with cups, gives them to the two ladies. My client says they begin engaging in a conversation with the two men, and my client drinks her drink, and within a very short period of time starts feeling woozy, queasy. Her friend and Mr. Hefner both notice this and apparently say to her, "Are you okay?" And Mr. Hefner offers her to go to one of the rooms to lie down. Initially, her friend says, "I'll take you." And at that point, Mr. Cosby says, "Don't worry, I'll take her there. I know where to go and how to get her there." So at that point, they leave. And according to my client, the next thing she actually remembers is waking up in bed, disrobed. Her clothes are askew on the ground. They're sitting around. She's laying on the bed without any clothes on, and Mr. Cosby is over her. And without getting into too many salacious details, doing things he shouldn't be doing. She wakes up, surprised and shocked, and he sees her wake up. He immediately stands up, doesn't say anything, pulls up his clothes, and leaves the room. And she leaves the house immediately after putting on her clothes, grabs her friend, and says, "Let's get out of here."
And did she make a police report shortly thereafter, or?
No, as with all of the women that have been coming forward, and I think we're now totaling roughly 32, between 32 and 40 women that have come forward now. Unfortunately, women in this class who are abused or taken advantage of, you find frequently are afraid, are scared, especially in dealing with men that have power and money. As I said, I've represented a number of victims in the past of sexual assault. One of those cases involved a multimillionaire on Palm Beach Island that was assaulting numerous underage girls, and none of them came forward at first because they were afraid. And the first thing that any woman thinks, especially when dealing with a rich and powerful man like Mr. Cosby, is this: I must be the only one. You know, it must only have happened to me, and nobody's going to believe me. No one's going to believe this really happened. So she was afraid. She was very afraid and intimidated by the concept of power and money, and thought hopefully that this would just leave her mind and never come back into her head again.
And this is something that we've heard with similar allegations, especially in Hollywood, with aspiring actors, singers. Your client was a model. When people are going to Hollywood to try to make a career for themselves, and they're in the presence of somebody that's a big star like Bill Cosby or someone like that, they're afraid that if they accuse them of something, that they might not be able to advance their careers in the industry.
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, and you're right. She was an aspiring model. She's a very beautiful young lady and wanted to get into the modeling industry. And obviously, one of the pinnacles is magazine, print industry. She's there at a party with Hugh Hefner. She doesn't want to make any waves. She's petrified for her career and future, like many women were that have now come forward with respect to what they said that Mr. Cosby did to them. Actresses and women in the industry all coming forward now say the same exact thing. I was afraid that he would destroy my career.
And, we've had a huge number of women that have come out accusing Bill Cosby over a period stretching all the way back to the 60s and 70s, including some very high-profile potential victims, including Janice Dickinson, I believe the wife of Lou Ferrigno, among others. And this brings up an interesting legal issue, which is the concept of prior acts or prior crimes that somebody might have committed. Normally, that's inadmissible in either a criminal case or a civil case under what's known as the exclusion of character evidence. A character evidence essentially is that you're introducing evidence of somebody's character to prove that they acted in conformity with that character on a particular occasion. So an example would be somebody robs a convenience store 20 years ago, and now they're accused of a similar crime today. Ordinarily, you couldn't introduce the past crime to say this is a bad guy, he's the type of guy that would commit the crime he's accused of, therefore he's guilty. But there are certain circumstances where prior bad acts can be introduced in court, and that has to do if there's a common plan or scheme, or if there's a modus operandi where there's something so specific about the way the crime is committed that it is individualized to that defendant. And that's going to be one of the arguments you're going to make. It's certainly going to be challenging because the presumption is that the prior acts don't get in. And we're talking about all these other accusers, whether you can add them to your witness list. Sure. If you could talk about the road ahead with respect to bringing in the evidence of these other accusers.
Yeah, one of the big issues, obviously, is that all of these women that have come forward, some of which have a very public voice, as you mentioned, are able to get their story out. But yet a lot of them feel robbed because other than getting it out into the press, there's really not a whole lot they can do with it at that point. All they can do is just talk. My client would actually give them a legal voice. This case would give them the opportunity under oath to raise their right hand and swear that this is what happened to them. So I'm hoping that by bringing my client's case forward, that it would give them the ability to do that. In addition, as you said, when you have something like a modus operandi that we have in this particular defendant of drugging women and taking advantage of them sexually when they've been drugged, this is something so specific that it's much like a serial killer type case where you've got a fingerprint or a signature that you can point to. That's what we're going to be looking at in our case. And I think that through the habit evidence doctrine, by establishing 30 plus women that have the same or nearly identical stories to tell, I think that it's going to be a convincing type issue that I think it would be hard for a court to deny us the ability to put that evidence in.
We're going to have to take a short break to hear from our sponsors, and then we'll be back with Spencer Kuven. Stay tuned.
This program is brought to you by the law firm of Altman, Flynn & Kugler. We practice elder law and intellectual property, including patents, trademarks, and copyrights. If you would like to patent your idea, please contact our Fort Lauderdale office for a free consultation. Call 954-563-4814. That's 954-563-4814. Or visit us online at altmanpatent.com. That's OLTMANPATENT.com. Spokesperson, not an attorney. This program is brought to you by Fresh Start Tax. Fresh Start Tax offers a full range of tax and accounting services, including tax return preparation and bookkeeping, as well as back taxes, wage garnishments, unfiled returns, or any other tax-related concern. Our dedicated team of tax attorneys, CPAs, and former IRS agents offer over 60 years of professional tax experience. For a free consultation, call 866-700-1040. That's 866-700-1040. You can also visit us on the web at freshstarttax.com. You're listening to Talk Legal with Jeff Van Treese, who brings you all the latest news in the legal world. If you would like to ask a question or share a story on the air, please call toll-free 888-565-1470. Once again, that's 888-565-1470. Now, back to Talk Legal with Jeff Van Treese.
And we're back. Our guest this evening is Spencer Kuven. He's an attorney with the law offices of Craig T. Goldenfarb. We are discussing his current case right now. He represents one of the alleged victims of Bill Cosby, the now mounting number of accusers in the sexual assault scandal. Like to turn our attention to the issue. We were talking about statute of limitations before, and how your client is currently the only potential victim that's within the statute of limitations. One of the interesting comments that Gloria Allred was discussing on television recently, because she represents some of the alleged victims that are well outside of the statute of limitations, is that she put a challenge out to Bill Cosby to waive the statute on the civil charges if he wanted to clear his name, which if you think if somebody was innocent and they were looking to clear his name, that's something that he could do. That doesn't seem likely that anyone would do that. Now that's kind of a stretch to say that an innocent person would necessarily do that, but what are your thoughts on her proposal?
I saw that when she challenged him on that issue, and I don't think it's realistic, and I certainly don't think she ever anticipated that he would do something like that. Obviously, as an attorney, first and foremost, as an obligation to your client, you'd never advise them to waive something like that. Because at the end of the day, if you were to waive something like that, whether it's true or untrue, you're opening yourself up for a whole bunch of lawsuits and litigation that's going to cost in the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars to defend, even if you were innocent. So it was really a hollow challenge, so to speak. But regardless, it's interesting. It's interesting to see how he may or may not respond to something like that. But I think what bothers my client and a lot of the women more actually is not so much what we on this side of it are saying, but what actually Bill Cosby is doing. I mean, he's going about his life and doing shows and trying to make people laugh and going to events as though nothing has happened. There are protesters that show up at events, and Gloria Allred is arranging some protests at a lot of his events. But for him to just go out there and say, business as usual, I'm just going to keep doing shows and making people laugh, when 30 plus women have come forward saying that you have essentially raped them or taken advantage of them sexually, I feel sorry or kind of sad for the people that are actually paying money to go to these kind of shows and watch this guy.
I mean, he's 77 years old. He was, America's TV dad for ages, and was considered one of the most brilliant comics in history. So I mean, he really did. The fall from grace was quite tremendous, and the reruns on his television show, The Cosby Show, have been canceled for the most part, or entirely. I haven't seen any on television since the accusations, since the claims were first publicized. This has got to have a pretty negative effect on the other actors who have their own careers and are completely innocent in all of this, who are probably no longer getting residuals and are no longer getting the exposure from having been child actors on The Cosby Show.
Yeah, I can only imagine the amount of money involved and losses involved as a result of what has now come to light. And there should be a lot of people angry at this man. Not only, first and foremost, cast members on his prior shows, but his wife, his friends, people that didn't know this side of him and what it's sad when you have someone of this age when this finally comes to light, because none of us want to heap on our elders this kind of thing, especially not someone who's been built up over the years, as you said, to be a fantastic comic, a legend in the comedy field. But when the truth comes out and these things come to light, you can't just push it aside and say, we're going to ignore this because of the mountain of work that he's done. He needs to be taken to task for the whole man that he is, for the good things he did, and clearly the very bad things that he did.
And, this is an issue. A lot of people, when they hear about the idea of suing Bill Cosby, think that, you're going to get a huge chunk of his, his current estate, which is worth, $500 million or something like that. But it's really not quite that easy. And in fact, we saw that, I referenced the OJ Simpson case from 20 years ago, where the Goldman family had sued OJ Simpson and won in civil court for wrongful death action, and they have collected very little from him. That they were, for the most part, unsuccessful in actually collecting anything from his estate. They were able to get some percentage of his publication. He wrote a book afterwards, and they were able to get the royalties from that book. But they were not able to collect the millions of dollars that everyone had anticipated was going to happen, because when you're going after an individual, they can potentially divert money or divest themselves of their estate, and that can make it quite difficult to collect.
Yeah, it can. I can tell you first and foremost, though, my client, the only thing she was worried about was trying to seek justice, and her primary focus initially was trying to seek justice through the criminal court system. Once she saw that this had happened to other women and that she was potentially the only one that could bring him to justice, she wanted that, and that was her primary focus, as opposed to any type of compensation in any civil proceeding whatsoever. And at the end of the day, even in a civil proceeding, if no criminal proceeding comes to light or comes forward, like you said in the OJ Simpson case, she still wants to make sure that the world is made aware of what occurred through sworn testimony of all of these women, including herself, in the civil proceedings. So even if she never collects a single dime as a result of her litigation, at the end of the day, if she can seek justice and get a verdict that shows that, in fact, what she says occurred did, in fact, occur, I can tell you that'll make a difference in her life growing up and feeling better about and more positive about herself.
And of course, the principal purpose of a courtroom is to get to the truth, where a jury can hear both sides and render a decision. And of course, this is also an opportunity for the defendant to tell his side of the story, and Cosby will be able to do that in his defense if he chooses to. So it'll be interesting to see, how the case develops. But I can't help but think, looking at this just sort of on the broader social level, we've always heard the phrase that some cases in this country, you're better off being guilty and rich than poor and innocent. And, we've seen people that have been exonerated by the Innocence Project. We hear the same story over and over again of people that have been convicted of crimes where they've had no money to pay for a defense, where there's very little or unreliable evidence against them, and they get convicted. And it takes years before they're exonerated. And then you look at cases, like this. We're talking about the Epstein case you were referring to earlier, which was a billionaire financier that was convicted of underage, having sexual relations with underage girls in a sex ring. People that can get away with some of these horrible crimes for years and years because of money, wealth, power, all the things you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, and you have to understand that we're looking at it within the culture that that exists now, as opposed to the culture that existed in the 60s and the 70s and even up until the 80s and 90s, where women really did not have the voice then that they have now in society to be able to come forward and accuse a man of doing something like this. When you look back historically at the 60s and 70s, when women would come forward with accusations like this, it was the victim, accuse or blame the victim mentality. We had laws that were passed because of that concept, saying that you can't blame the victim. So in a society that exists now, do I think that something like this, in other words, 40 or 50 years of abuse of women, could occur? I would hope not. But unfortunately, because of the nature of what's occurring and the age of some of the women that it occurs to, it does. And it can go on for years, and it's many hidden secrets in not only the general public, but in families.
You know, we're going to have to leave it at that. This is quite an amazing story, and we'll be following it closely. And hopefully justice will prevail in any event.
I hope so.
So I'd like to give you an opportunity to give your contact information out to our listeners in the event they're in need of your services.
I appreciate it. Thank you. As you mentioned, I do practice here in the West Palm Beach area, but we have a nationwide practice. Our phone number is 561-697-4440 or 1-800-GOLD-LAW.
Thank you very much. You've been listening to Talk Legal. I'm your host, Jeff Van Treese. Please tune in next week, Tuesday night from 6 to 6:30, where my guest will be criminal defense attorney Eric Schwartzreich, and we'll be discussing some criminal cases that are in the news. I'd like to thank all of our listeners once again for joining us. Please visit our website at oltmanpatent.com, oltmanpatent.com, where you can view all episodes of this show. I'd like to give another special thanks to my guest. Thank you so much, and have a great evening.
Thank you for listening to Talk Legal with Jeff Van Treese. Tune in next week for more insightful and exciting information about the law. You can contact Jeff by email at jvt2law@gmail.com or give him a call at 561-789-6866. That's 561-789-6866. The content of the preceding program, including